Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yasmin Samantar, and I'm working at the IEA on the World Energy Outlook team. So thank you for joining us for the IEA Africa University webinar this morning. This webinar is organized by the International Energy Agency for African energy experts. Today, we're very happy to have Trevor Criswell from the IEA's Renewable Energy Division present our Renewables 2020 report. We'll zoom in on Africa, so get ready for a very insightful presentation. While we're waiting for the remaining participants to join us this morning, please allow me to set the stage and provide some context. So as some of you already know, the IEA is an intergovernmental institution at the heart of the global energy dialogue, as well as the dialogue on energy transitions and climate. We're a team of 300 based in Paris. We've been covering all fuels and all technologies for nearly 50 years. And concretely, our work is divided up into three core areas. Firstly, data collection. We provide data through collection with countries based on partnerships with our governments as well as external partners. In Africa in particular, we work with AFRIC under the African Union. And we're pleased to continue working with all of you and your countries and officials working on statistics and also to facilitate discussions on how to collect, treat, and make statistics more reliable. The IEA offers policy advice to policymakers. For example, we convey high-level summits, and each year, alongside the African Union, we host a Pan-African Ministerial Summit that gathers African energy ministers from across the continent, and we convene to discuss top priorities for the continental energy agenda. And thirdly, we support the implementation of these policies towards a more secure, affordable, and sustainable energy system and sustainable energy future. This more concretely translates into capacity building initiatives, as well as reinforcement trainings that are custom tailored to each country's needs. Today's webinar happens under the framework of our capacity reinforcement program that we're hosting, along with the support of the European Union. It's a capacity reinforcement training on both energy statistics as well as energy modeling. We're working with 10 Sub-Saharan African countries, and we organize country by country trainings. We've already done some with our colleagues in Ethiopia, and there are more countries that are to come throughout the course of this year. We start with online webinars, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then we organize in-country workshops. Beyond our courses, we also organize various activities for our community of African energy experts, including webinars like this one. And we're thrilled to welcome colleagues from all across the continent and the world today. We use WhatsApp groups to stay connected and to update you all on our upcoming events. For those of you who are not part of our WhatsApp groups, please message me or one of my colleagues on the chat today, and we'll be happy to add you. Finally, please save the date for our next IEA Africa University webinar on our 2021 oil market report, and that will be held on Thursday, April 8th at 10 a.m. GMT+1. Before entering into the findings of the report and giving the floor to Trevor, let me set the stage. And please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Now let's have a look at energy statistics and long-term planning projections for renewables, as this is what our training program is essentially about. And as we insist on during our trainings, if we want to look ahead and explore what the future could look like, you need to understand today's situation as well as study past trends. On this chart, you can see the energy mix, in particular, the total primary energy demand for Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. Looking at 2019 statistics, you can see that firstly, biomass weight is huge, mostly to meet the cooking needs, followed by oil for transport and to a way lesser extent for power generation. Renewables, the dark blue band, is a limited share of overall total energy mix. Statistics collected and estimated for 2020 show that the total energy demand dropped in the region. Renewables has increased by 3% from 2019. And looking at the electricity mix, renewables make 40% of installed capacity, but 60% of generation, with 140 terawatt hours of renewable. Now let's look at the future. What could the energy mix look like in 2040? We can explore this with different scenarios. In the STEP scenario, energy demand for renewables is multiplied by almost 5 compared to 2020. In the SDS, a scenario meeting universal access to electricity and climate goals, renewables are multiplied by 7, while TPET decreased by 10%. This drop is due to efficiency gains and moving away from traditional use of biomass. I'll end here and give the floor to my colleague Trevor. Please remember to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to ask questions throughout his presentation, and we'll address them all at the end. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Yasmin, for that wonderful introduction. As mentioned, my name is Trevor Criswell. I'm an analyst in the Renewable Energy Division at the IEA. I'm very happy to share with you today the findings of the Renewables 2020 report. The full report can be viewed online on the IEA website. We also have a data explorer, which allows you to look at both capacity additions and generation for 5 years for the entire forecast period. And you also have the opportunity to purchase the entire data set if you want to. So moving forward, I don't think I need to tell anyone here that 2020 provided an incredible shock to energy systems around the world. And the reduced demand across all sectors saw emissions lowered by 6%, according to new IEA statistics that were published last week. And COVID has an impact across multiple sectors. We see that electricity is down 2%, though it's not as impacted as heat or transportation due to the need for critical infrastructure to be powered, such as hospitals and IT. Heat is down nearly 4%, and transportation sector is the most impacted sector as travel restrictions kept people off the road and from traveling. However, if we look at the renewables sector, we see that in electricity, the output of renewables actually grew at nearly 7% in 2020. Heat saw little impact due to trends in industries and buildings, while transportation biofuels, which we'll get into next, saw the most significant decrease. And as we move forward, we're going to be going through different sectors. We're going to be moving right to left on this figure. We're going to start with transport, move to heat, and then move to electricity. So as we saw on the first slide, biofuels have seen the largest impact due to COVID-19. 2019 was a record year with 162 billion liters produced, and we looked forward to seeing that trend continue in 2020. However, COVID really interrupted the market. So we saw two trends in 2020. The first was a small increase in output in smaller markets, such as Indonesia. But the second was that growth in those markets was more than offset by output contractions due to reduction in demand for gasoline and diesel, while lower prices also made biofuels not as competitive. So just to look at some major markets, output was down for USA ethanol, 12%, down for Brazilian ethanol, 16.5%, and down for EU biodiesel, 13.5%, for an overall decline of 11.5%, or 144 billion liters from that 162 billion liters that was produced in 2019. So where does that leave biofuels? As mentioned, we will see an 11.5% reduction in 2020, and we do not think that we are going to see a full recovery until Q4 of this year. As a result, the market won't see growth above 2019 levels until 2022. However, once the impact of COVID is fully lifted, the IEA expects biofuel production to average 182 billion liters per year from 2023 to 2025. We'll be seeing the largest increases in China, Brazil, the United States, and also the ASEAN region. So by 2025, biofuels are anticipated to amount for around 5.5% of road transportation demand, which is up from 4.8% in 2019. Moving on to the next sector, heat. I want to start by noting heat in context. Heat is the largest energy end use globally, and it is dominated by fossil fuels. As a result, 40% of all global energy-related CO2 emissions come from heat. So there is room for renewable heat to make an impact. However, we've seen that renewable heat uptake has been slow, with the share of renewables in heat only adding 2 percentage points in the last 10 years. And the total market share will remain below 11% in 2020. We are seeing increases in renewable heat, mostly due to renewable electricity, which are powering electric boilers and heat pumps. So where does that leave us moving forward? We expect renewable heat consumption to increase by 20% by 2025, and this is due to trends in buildings. We'll see the largest impact in bioenergy and renewable electricity. They will see the largest absolute growth. We also see a role for clean cooking with biomass in Africa, in India. However, even with this increase, the share of renewable heat could only be 12% by 2025. And this is due to increased overall heating demand throughout the world. So that 40% greenhouse gas number that we looked at the very beginning, will see a little effect of that number. But the good news is that governments are tackling this issue with stimulus packages that are emphasizing renewable heat, and they're providing financial support for technologies, and then also building retrofits to help incorporate some of these new renewable heating technologies. So this is a trend that we're going to continue to watch and monitor moving forward, especially as low fossil fuel prices impact the cost competitiveness of renewable heat. One renewable heating technology I really wanted to focus on before we move into renewable electricity is solar thermal. The global solar thermal market consumption is made up of 90% of solar hot water heaters for domestic water heating. And we see that policy support is really being realized in social housing programs, which incorporate these types of technologies into the overall plan. We expect the market to increase 4% in 2020, which is similar to what we saw in 2019. In terms of markets, China is the world leader, which is about 70% of the market for both total installed capacity and newly installed capacity. However, that market has been declining for the last 6 years, and this is due to a slowdown in construction as well as lower subsidies. And this is coupled with an increased competition with heat pumps and then also roof space for distributed PV systems. Other markets include the Middle East, which is the fastest growing market. And we also see lots of potential for Africa, given the abundant resource. And policy can help, as the regulation in South Africa, which helps introduce solar thermal systems into new builds. So transitioning into renewable electricity, 2019 was a record year for renewables deployment. And the IEA in 2020 produced 2 forecasts. We produced a May update and we produced our November full report. Now, it's important to note that in May, the total capacity additions, which are represented by that diamond you see in the figure, focused on the immediate impact of COVID-19. This disrupted supply chains, led to work stoppages, and impacted financial markets. However, as time went on, it became clear that renewables were resilient, and the revised forecast in November forecast actually another record year of renewables in 2020, something that preliminary numbers show to be the case. We expect that growth to continue in 2021 as more markets continue to make a recovery from COVID-19 economic impacts and more projects continue to come online. However, we want to caution that 2022 will present some challenges as major markets are going to be transitioning policies. So it'll show how much policy has an impact on renewables deployment, as well as what other avenues developers or governments or independent or individual consumers can take to install renewables without subsidy support. So before we get into some of the markets that we'll be looking at today, we wanted to measure some other trends as well. So in this November update, the IEA looked at multiple ways of measuring renewable output and the renewable market and the resiliency. And the first we looked at was the stock market and the wind and solar sector as compared to the rest of the energy sector. So the energy sector as a whole saw a slowdown in March, as every sector did, and has recovered some, but is still down 40% for the year. However, the wind and solar companies did differently, which a large increase in stock prices through the end of October 2020, which shows us multiple things, but two things to stick out. One, that there is a strong interest for investors to invest in these countries, and this could be anything from liking the market to indicating that these companies have a strong financial position, even if there were revisions to guidance after COVID-19. The second piece is that these companies are poised to grow in the future, which is a good indicator of the future market. Speaking of future markets, another measure we looked at was the global auctioned renewable capacity from January 2019 to October 2019, the same time period in 2020. As we can see, roughly 45 gigawatts of solar of renewable capacity was auctioned in 2019, which was actually surpassed in 2020 with the same time period, which shows us two things as well. One, governments are still very interested in incorporating renewables into their overall energy mix. And two, companies still want to participate in these auctions and build these types of sites. Now, it's important to note that there were delays in these auctions due to COVID-19. However, these auctions were not canceled, which was something that was really great to see. So what is driving some of this renewables growth outside of the auctions that we just discussed? And I think it's important to note that policy does still drive about 70% of the additions through this forecast period through 2025. This is due to the auctions as just discussed, but also due to other programs like feed-in tariffs or feed-in premiums. However, we're beginning to see new trends to help further growth. Corporate PPAs and merchant plants are resulting in 15% of the growth from 2020 to 2025. And while that may not seem like much, this type of growth outside of distinct policy support is a number that has been growing and is going to be an increasing driver of new additions, and is something that we will continue to watch as the markets continue to evolve. And then finally, I want to end, before we get into markets for renewables growth, I want to end on a high note. There's going to be a major shift in global electricity generation. Right now, coal is the largest source of electricity generation worldwide, but that is poised to change in 2025 as renewables combined will overtake coal as the largest generator of electricity, which is an incredible achievement and something to celebrate. We want to point out that hydro is the largest source of renewable energy generation, followed by wind and solar PV. I just wanted to point out hydro because I'll be talking about hydro a little bit today, but talking a lot about wind and solar. So I wanted to note that hydro generation is kind of the backbone of renewable energy generation. So we see that there is momentum continuing to build, which is going to have a great impact in the coming years. So let's now take a look on some of the markets that are starting to drive this renewable capacity growth. We'll start in China, which is the largest renewables market in the entire world. In fact, we expect that over 40% of new additions through 2025 will come from plants in China. However, as we see in other markets, the Chinese market is not immune to the boom-bust cycle of policy deadlines. 2020 had a deadline for PV and onshore wind subsidies, which saw an increased deployment, where 2021 has a deadline for offshore wind subsidies. But what you see is the figure shows is there is a slight decline in additions. And this is due to the 14th five-year plan, which will be announced at the end of 2021. These new policies will take time for developers to digest and will lead to that dip. An important note is that hydro will see record additions in 2021 and 2022 as mega projects come online. Beyond 2022, we expect additions to regain momentum as the 14th five-year plan and associated policies take effect. We expect an average of 44 gigawatts of solar and 23 gigawatts of wind per year from 2023 to 2025. Our accelerated case, we produced two cases in the renewables market report, the base case and then our accelerated case. We anticipate a 20% higher growth if there's a smooth transition to the new policy, as well as strong targets that are forecast in the five-year plan. Moving across the Pacific to the United States, 2020 saw record renewables growth in the United States, and this is due to federal policy incentives. The wind market saw little, if any, impact from COVID-19, while the solar market rebounded nicely in the third and fourth quarter after a small dip in the second quarter due to COVID-19 restrictions. But moving forward, the United States is at a crossroads as federal subsidies begin to phase out. while the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, which are both federal programs for wind and solar respectively, have been extended. Removing these federal programs have us looking for different drivers of growth. And fortunately, those different drivers of growth are beginning to emerge in numerous ways. The first are state-level renewable portfolio standards, which are encouraging utilities to incorporate additional renewable capacity into their power supply mix, which is sparking both independent power producer activity plus utility bills in vertically integrated markets. In addition, states are including offshore wind in their larger decarbonization plans, which is helping move forward offshore development, guaranteeing pricing, and also removing some political barriers that have been historically hindering that market. Corporates are also getting involved in PPAs, using PPAs to increase the amount of green energy in their portfolios, which is giving developers an opportunity to sell firm power at a fixed price, which is helping remove some of the price uncertainty. And this can be exemplified by the over 22 gigawatts of new combined wind and solar corporate PPAs that we saw in 2019 and 2020. At the distributed level, individual consumers are beginning to install more PV as the prices of systems decrease, and net metering continues to be financially beneficial. The accelerated case sees additional growth for offshore wind as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management speeds up their decision-making process for the outstanding proposed wind farms. Solar PV can also accelerate with an even greater increase in corporate buying, while the distributed sector is going to continue to be benefited by lower system costs as well as increased net metering subsidies. Moving to Europe, I want to point out that the European market is growing and that the figure is a little bit deceptive. While there was a decrease in additions in 2020, the 2019 additions were due to major growth in Spain. There was a major policy deadline that saw the country and the market add over 7 gigawatts that year. So if you remove Spain, you would actually see a 4% year-over-year increase from 2019 to 2020 for the bloc. And we see that growth continuing to accelerate to meet 2030 targets with over 250 gigawatts of growth over the next 5 years. So I want to focus on the 4 largest markets before we move on. The first is Germany, which is the largest market, which will see an addition of over 40 gigawatts in the next 5 years. This is due to increased targets and new auctions. There are some issues with onshore wind permitting and social acceptance that we hope to see addressed. France is the next largest market where we see a good distribution between wind and PV additions. This is due to new auctions and then also very strong capacity targets, which are really helping facilitate that growth. There are issues with permitting that could hinder some growth, but we hope to see those addressed as well. Finally, the next market being Spain, which is seeing new growth, especially in PV due to competitive auctions. There's actually one that's scheduled to be held this year, as well as a very strong market for corporate PPAs within that country. Finally, we move on to the Netherlands, where they transition from the SDE Plus program to their new program. The SDE Plus program has been fairly smooth. These auctions are held twice a year, which is helping achieve growth in all sectors. There is some issue with grid congestion, but that is starting to be addressed by the grid operator, which is helping boost growth. In the accelerated case, we see a 40% more growth if those challenges associated with permitting, social acceptance, and grid congestion are addressed, and also if we also begin to see other growth outside of auctions, such as those PPAs or organic utility growth. So continuing to move on to our third largest market, India. India, unfortunately, was hit hard by the COVID crisis. As you can, the figure shows, we'll see a reduction of about 1/3 for PV additions and 2/3 for wind additions. So one of the issues was that projects that were already delayed were made worse by COVID. However, the good news is that those projects are continuing to come online or will continue to come online, and we'll see record growth for PV in 2021 and 2022. Actually, government statistics show that January 2021 added 1.3 gigawatts of new PV in that month alone. So we can see that there's a recovery underway already after the small dip we saw in 2020 due to COVID. There's also solid growth in wind, while the out years 2023 to 2025 will see major contributions from hydro as big projects come online. So what is driving these additions in India? We're seeing that auctions are really starting to have an impact. We're seeing higher auction volume and also awarded capacity in PV in 2020 than what we saw in 2019 and 2018. However, there is a caution for wind as we're seeing lower volumes and some undersubscription. So that's something to watch. And we see the growth could be higher if the government additions utilities financial issues, which have impacted both utility scale growth and distributed growth, also address grid upgrades and land acquisition. Moving on from India to the MENA region, as a whole, we anticipate the region to see solid growth of over 30 gigawatts total, and 70% of that growth is from PV. And what we're seeing is that major fossil fuel exporters are beginning to drive that growth. So that means countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Qatar are doing more to contribute to growth than they were from the 2014 to 2019 time period. And this is due to the price competitiveness that PV has with fossil fuel generation. So what is driving these additions? What's driving this increase that we're projecting in 2025? And it's mainly due to auctions, which are responsible for 80% of those additions. We're actually seeing some record low bids worldwide, averaging $13.5 to $16 per megawatt hour, which is incredible to see. However, we want to caution that this may not be replicated across major markets due to resource availability and some of the scale that is available in the MENA region. So we are seeing these low prices, which is contributing to this growth, but we could see even more growth if there's additional access to financing and even more auctions. Moving on to wind, we'll see that growth in 2020 is lower as compared to 2019, and this is due to lengthy auction processes and stalled utility development. However, much like we saw in India, there's going to be a rebound in growth in 2021 and 2022, actually more than we saw in 2019. And this is due to projects in Morocco and Egypt commissioning, with average growth from 2023 to 2025 averaging 1.2 gigawatts per year. So as we look at the major markets, Egypt and Morocco, we want to know what's driving these additions, especially after what we saw in 2020. And what we see in Morocco is that development is driven by the Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Development, which had moved forward 400 megawatts of stalled wind projects forward, while Egyptian development is driven by bilateral contracts between independent power producers and renewables developers. What we're seeing is that these bilateral contracts, which is an unsolicited deal between a utility and an independent power producer, is resulting in a major driver of growth overall in the region, while auctions result in 20% of the overall growth. We are seeing some delayed auction results and some procedural hurdles that are impacting even faster growth. So if those are addressed, we will be able to see higher growth than we are in our accelerated case. So moving on to the Sub-Saharan Africa region, something I want to note as we look at this figure, we are seeing a trend, a move of shares away from hydropower more towards wind and solar. And this shows that there is plenty of interest to develop projects in Sub-Saharan Africa. This is due to governments and utilities investing in these technologies, aided by lower prices. But some of that capacity is not realized due to a couple of reasons. So let's first talk about the COVID-19 impact. COVID-19 did slow some development as works were shut down in countries like South Africa, or cross-border trade severely impacted project schedules. However, these projects have resumed construction after the first wave. So some of the issues that are hindering development precede and will outlast COVID. So in order for more development, project developers are going to need guarantees from governments and other organizations to help speed up these projects. These projects risks, which I'm sure you are familiar with, include off-taker risk, land rights issues, or project delays. And while governments have sought to mitigate some of these risks, through PPAs, retroactive renegotiation, or stringent requirements are further impeding the process, even after some projects have reached financial close. So these risks are being addressed in numerous ways by governments and international actors. For example, there was recently an 82 million euro grant to guarantee off-taker payment, which reduces that off-taker risks. So while all of these challenges are barriers, even addressing some of them will open up the potential for Africa, including solar PV. Moving on to solar PV in Sub-Saharan Africa, we see the short-term growth being driven by South Africa. This is due mainly to auction projects coming online, despite those COVID-19 project shutdowns, which we were discussing. Kenya and Ethiopia are also seeing projects come to fruition, which is leading to additional growth throughout the region. There are still some investment risks associated with these projects, and access to finance and access to land continue to hinder some growth. However, there are innovative solutions to address these problems. For example, tenders that are including land rights in the tender, which allows developers to begin building as soon as the tender is awarded, as well as the lower costs of the technologies of reducing some financial risks. Outside of utility scale growth, we're beginning to see some commercial scale growth as well. In fact, 2020 saw 2 South African companies put out requests for proposals for small scale solar systems to firm their supply, as well as lower costs and lower their carbon footprint. So it's great to see a diversification of PV within the region. Our accelerated case shows much higher growth, mostly due to South Africa's integrated resource plan, which includes ambitious goals for solar PV. Before I move on, I want to highlight some trends that we saw in just this past year and recently this year. For example, there is 80 megawatts of new solar that is built and being ready to connect in Kenya. Just this year, there was a 40 megawatt tender for solar PV in Zambia, a 20 megawatt tender in Malawi, as well as a recently announced tender for 10 mini grids between 300 kW and 1 megawatt in Kenya. Speaking of mini grids, the IEA is also tracking off-grid development, and we expect off-grid to make up an increasing share of new additions. With half the people in Sub-Saharan Africa not having access to electricity, off-grid solar PV is expected to improve electricity access, and the forecast anticipates over 1 gigawatt of new off-grid PV to come online for the next 5 years, representing 20% of all PV additions in the region. And this expansion is threefold. One is in the form of government rural electrification programs, which are having RFPs to power critical infrastructure. The second are international organizations that are putting out grants to build mini grids. And the third are individual consumers that are leveraging the decreasing price of PV systems to install solar home systems to electrify their homes. And in a world post-COVID, this has only served to heighten interest in the developing mini grids, as relief packages have emphasized investing in renewable energy systems and programs to power health and sanitation infrastructure. Moving on from PV to wind, much like we saw with utility scale solar, wind capacity is beginning to increase in the region due to those auction projects in South Africa coming online. However, there are other projects that are coming online throughout the region. For example, Kenya saw the Kipeto wind farm, a 100 megawatt project, complete construction and connect in January, while Tanzania saw their first wind project, a 2.4 megawatt project, connect to the grid. There are some outstanding tenders in Tanzania, as well as in Ethiopia, which will help drive new capacity in the medium and long term, which we're looking forward to see come to fruition. There are barriers to continued growth. There are risks that need to be addressed, and these include infrastructure. And for that Kipeto wind farm, they're also required a 17-kilometer transmission line required to connect that project, which could have led to some delayed commissioning. So given these projects' sizes, it is necessary that the infrastructure is invested in to connect these projects to the grid. Long-term, our accelerated case sees much more capacity, again, by the capacity outlined in South Africa's integrated resource plan. And we see that there is major potential for wind throughout the continent. And we look forward to countries and utilities continue to invest in these projects. Finally, before we move on to questions, I want to highlight geothermal, as it is a major having a major impact in the region. Worldwide, there are 3 to 4 main countries that continue to dominate growth. Indonesia has the strongest ambition to become a world leader. But in Africa, Kenya has the largest potential. They're beginning to export their knowledge around the continent to neighboring countries to help boost that resource as well. 2020 saw a PPA for geothermal project be signed in Ethiopia, while there are other positive developments as well. But geothermal development throughout the world has many obstacles that aren't limited to just a single market. There need to be risk mitigation for development, as well as the exploration and the high capital intensity required. So these can be done through better resource characterization and also through public participation in exploration or guarantee schemes, which would allow to de-risk some of those exploration and capacity investment. So with that, I thank you everyone for their time, and we will move on to questions.
Thank you very much, Trevor. That was a great presentation. Before we dive into the Q&A directly, there was a question by Yusuf on whether participants would have a copy of these presentations. This webinar will be recorded and posted onto YouTube, and there'll be a link to download the PDF on YouTube as well. And we'll circulate that after it's uploaded. We have a first question from Peter from Nigeria. And he asks, has population influenced the development of renewable energy? If yes, how? Trevor, would you like to take that question?
Yes, thank you very much. So we're seeing that as the population grows in Africa, especially in Nigeria, which is 200 million people today, 330 million by 2024. The continent is 1.2 billion, 200 billion plus by 2040. We're seeing that this is having an impact, especially urbanization, on renewable energy development. We're seeing some of the distributed scale PV, including that off-grid PV, be a major player in making sure that there's a quick build to be able to power these new homes, as well as provide access and grid backup for systems as they continue to build out. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. Someone is raising their hand, and we have John.
Maybe to add on Trevor, while other people may ask additional questions, and to link with the capacity reinforcement sessions we have, when we do modeling and long-term projections on the energy sector, population is obviously one of the key drivers, so we will dive more into that in the training sessions. And as Trevor mentioned, there is a very dynamic population development in Africa with a young population, a population urbanizing very fast. Just to give a bit more insights on that, we expect by 2040 800 million people to we expect African population to increase by 800 million people, and 70% of these numbers, so almost 500 million, are people that will grow up or move to cities. So just to give you an idea of the scale, this is twice as much as the urbanization we saw in China between the 1990s and the years 2000. So, and this was 2 decades of Chinese economic boom. So we expect over the coming 2 decades a very important urbanization that will of course mean needs for cities to be built, for jobs to be created, for economic activity to be developed, and this of course entails demand for all the energy fuels and technologies, but as Trevor mentioned, obviously a critical demand for power and from the renewable sector. Sorry, just wanted to add this, and I think we have more questions we have been receiving in the meantime.
Yes, thank you so much, Arnaud. I think I will give the floor to John. He raised his hand first. John, could you please share your question with us? I'm not sure if it's working, but feel free to ask a question in the Q&A. In the meantime, we can address the Q&A questions. We have a question from Joseph Wilson. Why is renewable energy development in Sub-Saharan Africa low despite the abundance of renewable energy? What can be done to attract investments into the renewable energy sector? Trevor, I'll let you answer that one.
Thank you very much. So I think it's the things that we discussed in the presentation. There is tremendous potential for renewables in Sub-Saharan Africa. However, we are seeing some risks that are hindering these developments, and they can be anything from financial risk to grid development to, and this is going to sound a little bit ridiculous, potentially lack of resource. So what governments and utilities are doing is trying to come up with innovative ways to work with utilities, to work with independent power producers, to de-risk some of those concerns. I believe it was Ethiopia that included land rights in their most recent PV tender, which allowed for developers to bid on not just contributing to solar PV to the grid, but also would have that space to be able to develop that resource right away. We also see PPAs or feed-in tariffs, which are being used to guarantee pricing for projects, also de-risk some of the financial issues that have come up. So what's great where these risks are being identified, they're also being addressed, and that's not just an individual, and not just independent power producers doing it, but they're working hand in hand with utilities and then also with the governments to ensure that these issues be addressed, so we can continue to move forward and build more renewable energy within the region.
And maybe to add on this question with the long-term perspective. So indeed, if we look today at Africa and more specifically at the solar PV technology, there is a mismatch between resource and installed capacity. Africa is home to 40% of the solar irradiance resource, but only home to less than 1% of the installed solar PV capacity, which is around 6 gigawatts. 6 gigawatts of solar capacity installed in Africa, and this is the same number in the Netherlands or the UK. And you would agree that Africa is much bigger and sunnier than the UK or the Netherlands. So there is room for increasing this number. When we look at the long term and when we develop scenario that would reach universal access to electricity, clean cooking, and climate goals, so our sustainable development scenario, we foresee a very, very fast development of solar PV. So looking at Sub-Saharan Africa without South Africa, today we only have 1.5 gigawatts of solar PV installed capacity. This number would grow to 250 gigawatts by 2040 under this scenario, so reaching universal access to electricity, for instance. And solar PV would be the first source of electricity generation by that time. So just to say that the potential is here, but on the short term, and as Trevor mentioned, there are some reasons explaining the low development and the slow development and some obstacles that can be tackled.
Thank you, Trevor and Alno. We have another question from Peter on what is the contribution of green hydrogen in renewable energy mix in Sub-Saharan Africa and globally? Alno, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not an expert on hydrogen. Just to mention that the IEA has been tracking hydrogen production in all regions, and for years, it's been, from my understanding, it's been mostly developed by relying on fossil fuels. So green hydrogen is some more recent trend, but which has a huge potential for development. The IEA is to work more on this topic and to release every year a global hydrogen report. So we'll soon be able to share much more findings and insights on this key technology and very promising topic.
Thank you, Alno. We have another question from Dania from Mozambique. We're in the energy transition process, but we have gas in high quantities. How can Mozambique deal with energy transition without jeopardizing for future returns? Do either of you have something to say to this?
Yeah, maybe I can start, Trevor, and if you want to complement on the potential for gas in Africa. So actually, we think that Africa is at a turning point on gas. Gas so far has been a niche fuel in the continent. If we accept North Africa, it's not been meeting a lot of the energy demand needs in Africa. But the key point which has changed over time is that over the last 8 years, 40% of the global discoveries of gas resources have happened in Africa. So there is, of course, this huge resource in Mozambique, also some resource in Eastern Africa, in Tanzania. If we go west, there's been big discoveries in Mauritania, in Senegal, and more recently, important discoveries in South Africa. When we look at those numbers, we think that there is, of course, potential for Africa to be an exporter of natural gas, but there is also room for using gas to develop domestic markets, and gas can be used in the power sector as it has been over years, and there could be a good it could be a good way of balancing electricity output from variable renewables and to provide some baseload power. But gas can also be used to fuel Africa economic development and industrial development as feedstock, as fuel for heat, and there is room for gas to really support Africa economic development. In the case of Mozambique, I think considering the importance of the resource, there is a big question of regional integration and being able to deliver this resource to regional markets to make the most of them.
Thank you, Arnaud. Sorry, we are getting a lot of questions. This is great. It seems that people are very interested. I think I'll start with this question. What can you comment on the dwindling trend in bioenergy addition in Sub-Saharan Africa towards 2025? Trevor, I'll let you take that one.
Thank you very much. And we recognize that there is tremendous potential for bioenergy in the Sub-Saharan Africa region. But what we're seeing is that when there is a lot of interest and there are a lot of projects that have been announced or permitted, we're seeing not as a lot of those projects are not coming to securing financing or coming under construction. So as we look towards 2025, we are seeing trends emerging that show that there's heightened interest, especially with the heightened resource. However, we are not seeing the necessary investment required to forecast increasing capacity. So this is much like the other technologies that we've been discussing, that while there are barriers, specifically high capital intensity or some infrastructure concerns, if those are addressed, we'll start seeing a boost in that resource throughout the region.
Thank you, Trevor. One moment.
There is a question on the role of women and gender in energy access.
Yes. Hi, Bethlehem. Thank you for your question. Bethlehem asked, is there any research or publication around women's access to energy, especially for Sub-Saharan Africa or Ethiopia specifically? The IEA actually has a task force on gender and diversity, and we're doing a lot of research on gender, as well as research on access to energy. Our work, it's really heavily focused on in our work as of late. It's something new that we're pushing forward, and we will be happy to circulate more material with you that focuses on Sub-Saharan Africa in the future and Ethiopia, but we don't have anything specifically on Ethiopia right now.
Yeah, and maybe in our recent efforts to document how women have been affected by the lack of access of energy, we've released 3 years ago an energy access outlook, looking in depth into those questions. And for if we look at the clean cooking and the biomass topic, it is very well documented that women are the most exposed to first task related to firewood and fuel gathering, and this can take up to 5 hours in the day of productive time dedicated to collecting and preparing the meals. And then when it comes to the risk and hazards of dealing with traditional use of biomass, women and children are the most affected by indoor air pollution, as well as in certain cases when related to fuel collection, there are also many risks of violence against women. So many risks and many negative impacts, specifically looking at women. If we look at the other side, when we provide access on when households get access to electricity, this really unlock potential, especially for women, in terms of economic development, in terms of creation of economic activities. So it's there are clear numbers demonstrating the impact of getting access to a solar home system and being able to have longer a small shop or to attract more customers. So we can have a deeper look and try to send you some links and research papers on that.
Thank you, Arnaud. That was great. And we have a question from Francis on how can the IEA support Sub-Saharan African energy experts, those stationed in statistic offices and universities, in energy data access, for instance, grid data, and more importantly, in large-scale modeling and prediction of energy resources and consumption. Arnaud, I'll leave this to you.
Yeah, happy to take this one. Thank you, Francis. So actually, this webinar falls under the broader context of a capacity reinforcement program. Kenya is one of the focus countries that was selected with the European Union. So we will very soon propose some online trainings for a group of selected Kenyan professionals. We are happy to open it a bit more to some neighboring countries, but it will be looking firstly at helping Kenyan professionals on the statistical practices and on the development of modeling tools for long-term planning purposes to work together. And this shall happen online first, then it will be in-country training sessions, but the online sessions shall happen in the coming months. So stay tuned, we'll revert to you.
Thank you, Arnaud. Our time is almost up, so we'll try and answer as many questions as we can until then. But there's a question from Peter. During the presentation, Trevor forecasted very little contribution from bioenergy, especially between 2024 to 2026. Why is this, considering the abundance of bioenergy resources in Sub-Saharan Africa?
It's a very good question. And again, as we have been discussing, while there is an abundance of resource, there is not necessarily we haven't seen many projects that have been announced reach financial close or come under construction. And I think that it's good to see that there is an interest in the diversification of resources, but much like the other technologies, such as wind or solar, there are some concerns with infrastructure and capital intensity, which are hindering the development of this technology. So while countries are taking steps to mitigate that by creating their own divisions or working with third parties or investor and IPPs to help develop this resource, we really want to see that continue to develop, especially in the out years, to really diversify where everyone's getting their power from.
Thank you, Trevor.
Maybe Jasmine, I can take the one from Laurent, which is asking if we have considered the impact of e-mobility adoption in different countries on energy demand. And if yes, what's the contribution compared to overall energy demand? So yes, when we do long-term projections and modeling, looking at 2040 or 2050, we look at each and every subsector of the energy world. And when we look at transportation, we look how different fuels and technologies can meet demand. So, and can meet the needs. And of course, electricity is one of them. We are already seeing in developed economies that electricity and mobility is rising fast. In the case of Africa, we also foresee some adoption of electricity mobility, mostly for the road transportation sector. I don't have in mind the numbers of its contribution, but it's although it's still small compared to the transportation, we expect by 2050 it to be around 5% of the energy consumption, just checking the numbers live. So there is room for e-mobility to grow over time.
Thank you very much, Arnaud. We're almost out of time, but there's a comment from Gambwe. He says, my expectation during in-country trainings is that there'll be information specific per country on energy dynamics, because from the global presentation, it might be difficult to relate to country status. Arnaud, would you like to add that?
Yeah, sure. We'll try to be as country specific as possible. Maybe to mention that last year the IEA released an Africa Energy Outlook report, which is free. But what we've done is both modeling at the regional level and also for a few specific countries. So in the case of Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, and other French-speaking countries. We've looked country by country at what the numbers are today, how they have evolved over time, and what could the future look like based on different scenarios. So we can, of course, share in the WhatsApp groups and by email links to those documents, which are free. We also have translated them in local languages, including Swahili and Portuguese. So we are very happy to share all those analyses, which are very diving deep into the country situation.
Perfect. Thank you, Arnaud. It looks like we're out of time. This has been a great hour. Thank you so much to all of our participants and attendees for joining us. We hope that you found this presentation by Trevor and the Q&A by Arnaud and Trevor as well very enlightening. And please don't forget to join us on Thursday, April 8th for our next IEA Africa University webinar on our 2021 oil markets report. And we'll circulate all of that information via WhatsApp and through email as well. Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I'll end the presentation.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.